Welcome to the Alaska Department of Education's Technical Assistance Training on Disproportionality and Special Education Reporting. My name is Sam Jordan. I'm one of the administrators with the Special Education Unit, and I'll be taking you through the training today. During today's training, we're going to do an overview of disproportionality, including what is disproportionality and how does Alaska measure it. We'll review disproportionality reporting and the format that Alaska uses and look at a sample report. And then we're going to discuss what happens once you're found to have disproportionality at the district level. So what is disproportionality in special education? Simply put, it's an overrepresentation of certain student populations found eligible for special education, either at a school level or a district level. When we determine disproportionality, we look at a school's population and then look at the percentage of students in specific race and ethnicity categories who are in special education and look for an overrepresentation. Disproportionality measures apply to all racial and ethnic groups, but Congress has put a specific regulatory focus on minority groups. When the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act was reauthorized in 2004, Congress noted several things specific to disproportionality. Number one, more minority children continue to be served in special education than would be expected from the percentage of minority students in the general education population. Number two, African American children are identified as having mental retardation and emotional disturbance at rates greater than their white counterparts. Number three, in 1999 school year, African American children represented just 14.8% of the population, ages 6 to 21, but comprised 20.2% of all children found eligible for special education services. Those were the realities back when the authorization took place. They represented a bias in the educational system. Those realities continue to this day in 2015. Nationally, looking at the school years between 2006 and 2010, given the population of students with disabilities, we can see that African American students and Native American students were overrepresented in special education. At the same time, Hispanic students and Asian and Pacific Islander students were underrepresented, both issues of disproportionality within the system of special education in the United States. In a February 2013 letter from the General Accounting Office to Senator Tom Harkin, disproportionality was explained in this way. The overrepresentation of minority students in special education continues to be a persistent and challenging issue in education. This is a complicated issue because it is often difficult to determine if a student is struggling in school because of a disability or, as some suggest, other factors such as poverty, limited English proficiency, or factors within the school environment, such as a lack of high-quality instruction or cultural bias. To illustrate, a 6th grade Hispanic student who is not proficient in English may be diagnosed as having a learning disability because she is not reading at a grade level. Similarly, an African American boy who may be acting out in school because of problems at home may be diagnosed as having an emotional disability. The consequences of overrepresentation have serious implications for students who may be inappropriately identified as having a disability, because these students are placed in an educational track that is different from their peers, which may negatively impact their academic and career outcomes. In terms of monitoring disproportionality at the state level, the expectation is that, number one, states define disproportionality measures for our state. In our case, Alaska uses a risk ratio analysis that answers the question, what is a specific racial ethnic group's risk of receiving special education and related services compared to the risk for all other students? And it's important to point out that in doing our analysis, we are comparing each district with itself and its own populations, not comparing that district against the state. The second thing is that states are expected to conduct a yearly analysis of data to determine whether the disproportionality is as the result of problematic policies at place in the district problematic procedures, or problematic practices. Alaska, as well as other states, review for the categories of Hispanic, American Indian, Native Alaskan, Asian, Black, Pacific Islander, white, and then multiple races and ethnicities, consistent with all other federal reporting. Alaska looks at disproportionality from 4 different perspectives. The first is simply the identification of students into special education. The second is the identification of students into specific disability categories. The third is for placement of students into specific educational settings within special education. And finally, looking at whether there are disparities in the issuance of disciplinary actions among students with disabilities. Disproportionality, again, is defined as a risk ratio analysis. For Alaska, our stakeholders determined that in order to be considered disproportionate, your risk ratio has to be equal to or above a risk ratio of 2.5. When that happens, there are specific activities that then are going to be required of the district. Most notably, that the district dig deeper into that data to look at whether there are inappropriate policies, procedures, or practices. If any of those policies and procedures or practices are problematic, then the district is required to correct non-compliance that they identify. For significant disproportionality, there is a risk ratio of being equal to or greater than 3.5, and that's over the course of 3 consecutive years. The reason for that is that we want to allow for districts to be able to make correction to situations where they're able to identify a problem and then make those corrections. If that hasn't been done over the course of 3 years, especially in the case where there's a increased risk, then some federal guidance comes into play where districts are then required to use 15% of their Part B grant award in order to do intervention with the specific groups of students who are identified as having a greater risk for being either in special education or in a specific category, or specific placement, or disciplined at a higher rate. So let's now talk about understanding your disproportionality report. Your disproportionality report details the risk for identification, for placement, and for discipline, and the risk ratio for each racial and ethnic category of your district. On your report, you will see on the left side the areas of analysis, and then going across the page, you'll see it broken into those race and ethnic categories. And then the key to all of this is looking at any highlighting that takes place. So we have gone to the extent of identifying not only where there is disproportionality, but where there may be a risk of disproportionality. So you'll see in the key below, if it is a yellow highlight, it's at risk of disproportionality. If it's a light orange, that is an area where there has been disproportionality identified. If it's a darker orange, that's at risk for significant disproportionality, those higher rates. And then red identifies a significant disproportionality. So this is a copy of the exact report that you'll receive. You can see that this one is for statewide numbers for the 14-15 school year. You'll see again the areas of analysis on the left, very clearly spelled out. The top part being identification for special education, and then identification into certain categories within special education eligibility. The next area down is areas of analysis for least restrictive environments, and then finally at the bottom are areas of suspension or expelled greater than 10 days. Going across the page, you'll see that the numbers are broken out into race and ethnicity categories, and there's a risk and then a risk ratio for identification, for least restrictive environment, and finally for discipline. So here's an additional note to help you understand your report. As you're going through and looking at the different boxes that have highlights in them, you may notice that some boxes include 2 asterisks. What that means is the population used in that calculation was less than 10 students. Those, for the purposes of calculation, are statistically insignificant, and so we do not include those in our reporting to the federal government, but we point those out to you so that you can go through and just see if there are any concerns that you can follow up on. We may also, if we see that over the course of time as a state agency, ask you to follow up with some additional analysis. Some additional notes to help you understand your report. You may notice that there are boxes on your report where no numbers, no risk ratio, or risk are reported, and that denotes that there were no students in special education in that category, so therefore no calculation could be made. You may also note that there's an NA in some of your boxes. That simply means that the overall population of students in that category, special education and general education, was less than 10, and so we were not able to use those numbers in order to make a statistically reliable calculation. And so we've noted that with an NA. It's important to reiterate at this point that the numbers alone that are being given to you through this report are not enough to identify any biases in your system of special education identification. The numbers are simply a mechanism in order to prompt the next conversation, which is a review of your district and school policies, the procedures that are taking place in your district and in the schools, and then the practices at the district, school, and even caseload level to determine whether there is some sort of bias that's causing that disproportionality. It may be determined that there is no problem with your policies and procedures and practices, but we want to make sure that we have that conversation, and the data is what helps us get to that point. If you're able to identify a problem, then we're able to work on solutions, whether it's a systemic solution or simply a solution on the small scale within a school or within a specific caseload. When you're a district that has data that suggests disproportionality, we then ask that you as a district dig deeper into your policies, procedures, and practices and identify whether there are problems that are causing those disproportionate numbers. This is a self-assessment that we ask you to complete and send back to us. It's a self-analysis, and it's simply asking yourself some questions. We absolutely encourage districts to do this as a team, to get teachers and your special education administrators and your gen ed administrators together and talk through these very few questions and ask yourself, are there problems with our policies? Are there problems with our procedures and practices that might lend itself to a specific group being identified for special education at a higher rate? The first section of the self-assessment has you asking questions of yourself. The second section of it has you actually looking at student files, reviewing whether there are certain parts of the special education identification procedures in place and working within your district. And then finally, we ask you to then make corrections if those corrections are necessary. This final page allows you to put the area that you found there was non-compliance in your policies, procedures, and practices, to identify which policy procedure your district is going to revise, the people who are going to do that work, the evidence that you're going to submit to EED noting that change, and then your timeline for completing that work. And then that all gets sent back to our office, and we just keep track of it and hold you to this plan of action that you have told us you're going to do. There's an additional self-assessment that is included with your report. It's not required as a part of being identified as disproportionate, but it is a good complement to the work that you will be doing in just assessing disproportionality. It's a view of the school climate as it relates to students with disabilities and whether the schools are inviting and supportive of students and families who experience disabilities in your district. And it's meant to get to the question of whether the district is being appropriate and providing an equitable education climate. So we encourage you to use this tool. Again, it's a tool that's meant to be used with a team, not just one person, but to really have an in-depth conversation about the climate as it relates to students and families experiencing disabilities. This is just one page out of that school climate self-assessment. Again, it identifies areas of interest and concern, and then you self-assess and rate yourself. And at the end of this, you'll add up totals, and it will help you identify areas where you, as a district or as a school even, can make improvement, and then allows you to put together a plan. Again, not a requirement for being identified as disproportionate, but can provide a really good mechanism for making change if it's needed. If you're a district who's been found to have significant disproportionality, and again that means that there has been disproportionality at a risk ratio of 3.5 or higher for 3 consecutive years, there are some federally mandated interventions that take place. Most notably is the district would be required to use 15% of their Part B funds to do what's called coordinated early intervening services. And what that means is you would be using those funds to do interventions with a very specific group of students who are experiencing a disproportionate representation in special education to try to address whether those students truly are students with disabilities or whether there simply need to be more supports provided in the general education environment so that they don't then directly go into special education evaluation. The district would have to report on those students and track them over the course of 2 years, and EED will then also have to do some sort of compliance, whether that's an on-site review or data review with you over the course of those 2 years. If you're a district that ends up being required to direct 15% of your funds, our office will be there to guide you through that. What would happen is that in the next year's grant, you'll be filling out a CEIS application that details the kind of interventions that you're going to be doing and the personnel who are going to be doing those interventions, as well as the student population that you're targeting. You're going to provide some budget information detailing how you're going to be using that allocation of money, and then how you're going to be tracking those students over the course of time for the first year of intervention as well as 2 years following those interventions. And our office will be there to guide you through that if this is something that your district has to be involved in. The final area of disproportionality that our office reviews is in discipline, and the process is a little bit different than the self-assessment. When it comes to discipline reviews, there's a requirement to do a monitoring of actual student files. So when a district is identified as having higher rates of suspension or expulsion for a certain group of students with disabilities, our office is going to contact you directly, and we're going to request specific documentation. We're going to target certain students and ask for those files and review policies, procedures, and practices relating to the provision of services on day 11 of suspensions, the process for determining whether a suspension constitutes a change of placement, the process of determining whether a behavior is a manifestation of a child's disability and whether that process is inclusive of all the participants that are supposed to be there. The use of functional behavior assessments as appropriate, the development of behavior intervention plans or BIPs as appropriate, and the potential use of an interim alternative education setting. So, but again, if your district is required to do this discipline review, we'll be contacting you and we will guide you through that process. If during the course of doing disproportionality work in your district, you have personnel who'd like to know more, or if you as a district would like to reach out for an agency to help with this, there is an agency called the Equity Assistance Center. There are 10 of them across the United States. Our region is number 10. The agency is out of Portland, but they serve Alaska as well as other western states. Included with your disproportionality report is an actual request for assistance from the Equity Assistance Center. And so you can reach out to them directly to receive various levels of assistance, whether it's just advice or actually someone to come on site and help you out with discussing disproportionality, discussing school climate, even discussing discipline policy and how to shift those to be more equitable. The other resource that I'd point you to is this discussion of disproportionality in special education that's put out by LRP, which is a well-known publishing house of information on special education. They have a really robust guide that discusses the origins of this work as well as the different kinds of factors that play into disproportionality in special education. So this is a great resource that you could either have for your staff or just call upon to think about the different aspects of disproportionality in your program. And that concludes the discussion of disproportionality reporting for the state of Alaska. If you have questions about this, please reach out to our office. You have our contact information as a part of your report. You can contact me directly, Sam Jordan, at samuel.jordan@alaska.gov. Thank you all very much, and we hope this has been helpful.